So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Indivisible Charlotte's In the Know Live program. I'm Carolyn Eberly, the founding director of Indivisible Charlotte. Tonight's event, Autocracy Inc., a discussion with Anne Applebaum, kicks off our No Kings 2 weekend. We are thrilled to have such a distinguished guest with us to discuss the forces undermining democracy around the world and how we can stand together to resist them. For those of you who may not know us, Indivisible Charlotte has been educating and engaging our community in civic and electoral activism for over 8 years, with the goal of strengthening democracy. So you can learn more about our work and upcoming events by visiting our website, indivisibleclt.org. I think that will be dropped into the chat as well. So now I'll turn it over to Marshall Arron, Indivisible Charlotte's research coordinator. Marshall.
Thanks, Carolyn. I'll be moderating tonight and asking questions along with Pat Rosa, a member of our Indivisible Charlotte research team. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Now, just to let you know, we're recording tonight's program and it will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll intersperse questions that were submitted in advance as well as questions submitted live during our program. If you'd like to submit a question, please send it privately in the Zoom chat to Wes Fryer. Wes will be collecting the questions to share with Pat and me during the hour. Pat, so why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
Okay, I would be honored to. I'm a big fan of Anne Applebaum, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic and also the author of many critically acclaimed and award-winning books, including Autocracy Inc., Twilight of Democracy, Red Famine, Iron Curtain, Between East and West, and Gulag, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Anne divides her time between Poland, where her husband is foreign minister, and Washington, D.C., and she's in the Washington area this evening while she's joining with us. Thanks, and glad to have you here, Anne.
So thank you so much. And first of all, apologize for this backdrop and the possible background noise. I was meant to be doing this from a studio, and there is an unbelievable traffic jam in Washington tonight, which I think might be connected to road closures in preparation for tomorrow. And so I'm still in the car. I may arrive at some point and then we'll decide what to do and whether I can switch to the place that I was going to join from. I'm really happy to be here with people who are engaged and interested and who care about our democracy. And maybe I should start though. I'll start by speaking a few words about the book I just wrote and what it has to do with what's happening here. My book, Autocracy Inc., was a description of a network of dictatorships. So it's not an alliance. It's not even necessarily close relationships. It's a group of countries who, about a decade ago or a little more, began to work together in a number of ways because they understood that the language and the ideas of liberal democracy were bad for them. And this is Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, as you probably know, but also Venezuela, Nicaragua, group of countries in Africa, elsewhere in Asia, who began to cooperate in use of the international financial system to steal and hide their money, who began to use and borrow one another's narratives. They began to build an authoritarian narrative that argued that autocracy is stable and safe and democracy is weak and divided. They also began to cooperate militarily and in other ways, and we've seen that most obviously in the war in Ukraine, where Iranian drones and North Korean troops have backed up Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And you can see them working together. In the past, they've worked together to prop up one another's countries. When you had a possibility of a peaceful democratic revolution in Belarus, you saw the Russians move in eventually with Chinese and other support to prevent that from happening. Actually, there's been a kind of Russian, Chinese, Iranian presence in Venezuela for the last decade. They also saw the preservation of that regime as something that was important to all of them. I'm not sure they still do, but they did for a long time. So they cooperate to keep one another in power. They cooperate to as I said, in the financial world. The state, quasi-state, quasi-private companies in one country will invest in the quasi-state, quasi-private companies in another. They simply have a group of common interests. I mean, I think from our point of view, the most important thing is the way they began to think about, first mostly the Russians, but then others, what they could do to undermine us. What was the language they could use? How could they break apart the links between democracies around the world, and also how could they attack the stability of existing democracies? I mean, the Russians first began experimenting with social media, again, more than a decade ago, looking at how they could amplify extremism, how they could use the particular properties of the internet to create, for example, a chain of websites that could process and share false information, how they could then boost that false information so that they so that extremist ideas of the right or the left or different forms of separatism, nationalism, identitarianism could be promoted. What they did, though, of course, was they established a kind of alternate world, a world of lawlessness, a world of, as I said, financial corruption, and they began to draw people from our world into it. And here's where I should stop and say that the Autocracy Inc., as I've described it, is not merely we're not living in a Cold War period where there are democracies on one side of a geographical line and dictatorships on the other. The battle over what kind of system should rule in a given country or in a given place or at a given time takes place not between countries, but inside them. So inside Russia, there's a very important democracy movement, or there was actually, it's been mostly destroyed. Inside China, there was the Hong Kong democracy movement that was also important, was also destroyed. In Iran, there's a civil rights movement, a women's rights movement, which has been very significant. And of course, in our country, the language and the methods that are used by the autocratic world are also evident here. And I don't want to also imply that it's something, there's a Russian project to destroy America that has succeeded. It's more complicated than that. It's more that the methods that were being used in Russia that were then imported into Hungary have then been copied by people in our country and by people in other democracies. So there's a kind of autocratic sharing process whereby the means of corrupting a democratic society and the means of building something different have simply been copied and used and reinterpreted over and over and over again. Since I wrote the book was published a year ago. Not much has, well, many things have changed, but the basic outline of what I described in the autocratic world, this relationship between big powers, the way in which they use their influence, the way in which they act towards us, hasn't really changed. But obviously, the big change in the last 9 months is inside our country. I'm going to stop here for 1 second and let me just check with the driver. So what I wanted to say is what we've seen happen in the United States over the last 9 months is very familiar. The tactics used by the Trump administration, well, of course, there are many things that are different because of the nature of our country, and then we are exceptional in many ways, but a lot of them are quite familiar, and they reflect the ways in which autocratic political parties or leaders have undermined or taken over democracies in other countries. Again, I don't think it's an accident. I think these are tactics that are learned. We know from many sources and from observation that many people around Donald Trump are great admirers, for example, of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who was also somebody who was democratically elected legitimately, and who then used the power of the state to create an unlevel playing field that would then make it harder for anybody else to win an election. And we see much of that happening inside our country. And so some of the things that seemed mysterious or bewildering at first, to me, have been very familiar from the beginning. For example, the firing of civil servants. This is something that actually you saw in Venezuela. Not all attempts to undermine a democratic system come from the right. Some have come in the past from the left, obviously. Hugo Chavez's government, one of the things that he did was fire civil servants, because civil servants are people who have taken oaths or otherwise have been taught to abide by the rule of law. They are people who have been in our country, have been promoted since the 19th century, late 19th century, on the basis of merit, on expertise. They are people who are not beholden to one political party or the other. They serve neutral aims. They're there to prevent distribute Social Security money or to collect taxes, and they're taught not to be politically partisan. And then if you're somebody who seeks to change the nature of the American state, then of course they have to go, because what you want instead is people who are loyalists, people who will take an oath to Donald Trump or to his administration, who will act on behalf of that administration, regardless of the law and regardless of habit or custom or tradition. And people will then be promoted or demoted inside the civil service, not based on whether they're good at their jobs or whether they're good at stopping pollution or distributing Social Security money, but whether they are loyal and whether they are reliable to the regime. And that's one example, but there are many others. I mean, the use of a paramilitary, of a militarized police force against ordinary people, which we've seen happen in Chicago. I'm in Washington, D.C., where we have actually National Guard troops on the street. We've also seen it in Los Angeles, and in Portland. This, first of all, goes very much against any American tradition. There's no American tradition of a president using the military or militarized police in a consistent, long-term, planned way. I mean, it's happened by accident a number of times, but it's never happened in this consistent a way in the last, in recent years, a federal force. This is also a tactic that you can see borrowed from other times in other places. I mean, in another country, ICE would be called the Interior Police, or they would be called the Interior Ministry Guards, or something. They would have a different name. But the use of a militarized force of the state against protesters, against individuals, and I know that I'm mixing up two categories here. I do distinguish between ICE and the National Guard, and they haven't been behaving in exactly the same way. But the ICE is being deliberately dressed as if they were soldiers. They're wearing masks as if they were, as if they had some kind of secret power or secret, orders. They can't be identified. They're behaving. They're rappelling onto the roofs of Chicago apartment buildings using Black Hawk helicopters. They're acting as if they were a paramilitary, although technically that's not what they are, or if they were military, although technically that's not what they are. And this use, the purpose of this, of course, is partly to make people afraid and make people anxious. It's also to build a narrative. And again, I've watched authoritarians build narratives in other places. It's to build a narrative about the president showing muscular force against his enemies, and that narrative, of course, is designed to polarize and anger Americans even more. So these are all, as I said, these are things that we've seen before in other places. They're borrowed from Hungary, they're borrowed from Russia, they're borrowed from Turkey. The use of I'll add one more: the use of what are supposed to be neutral federal regulatory bodies against the president's so-called enemies or against people he doesn't like. This is also a break in the American tradition, and it's a move in the direction of the autocracies who have for a long time operated on the basis that any institution that belongs to the state is controlled by the ruling party or by the leader. So it's not, there's no such thing as institutions that belong to everybody. Instead, everything becomes politicized, and you can use, a broadcasting regulator against a television station you don't like, or you can use, the IRS can examine people who are the enemies of the president, and so on. So I'll because of the awkwardness of this situation, and because I'm sitting in a car, I will stop my remarks here, and let you all ask questions. I think that will work a bit better. But that's
Thanks, Anne.
that's the essence of my argument. It's the essence of my book, and it's the essence of more or less what I've been saying for the last 9 months.
Thanks, Anne. Appreciate that overview. Pat, why don't you toss the first question?
Yeah, and what would you think that based on your knowledge and experience in this path, where do you think we are right now, the United States, on this path of liberal democracy to illiberal democracy?
So I want to say this in a calibrated way, because I don't want to give people the idea that something's over, but we are quite far along on the path towards at least political scientists have different names for it. You can call it illiberal democracy, or you can call it competitive authoritarianism, or you can call it a one-party state. We're quite far along on that path. A lot of it is, we're still in a kind of experimental phase. So the president has broken norms. In some cases, he's broken laws. We haven't quite got to the point where he's fully defied the Supreme Court in a really grotesque way. We haven't gotten to the point where he's violated the law after being told that he can't. There have been it's become very close to that. A lot of things have happened here much faster than they happened in other places. I think because this was, unlike the President Trump's first term, I think this time he has a group of people around him who were attracted to him after January the 6th, who, for different reasons, actually, I think there's some division in that coalition, wanted to carry out a kind of revolution, and who saw him as the tool to allow them to do that. They've been planning it for a long time. The most obvious version of that is Project 2025, which we could all read before the election, and some of which is being acted out. There are a few elements in our system that are new. I was actually I was doing an interview with Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who some of you might know, who's a very good historian at NYU, and who writes about, actually she's a Mussolini scholar, but she writes about authoritarianism. And I asked her about the assault on science, and especially medicine, that we've seen happen, and medical information and knowledge. And she couldn't think of a precedent for that. Maybe the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but that seems to be new. I think Doge, some of the early tactics going into government agencies and just shutting off the data system or stealing the data, I'm not aware of that happening anywhere else before, too. Having said that, we are a free society. We have many tools open to us. In theory, Congress can push back. Congress is in our Constitution is more important than the president. Congress decides about funding. Congress is much more representative of the nation. We just happen to have right now, in addition to the Trump administration, a Congress that doesn't want to push back against him, partly because of changes that have already began to happen, partly because a lot of people in Congress are afraid now, which is something that developed over the last decade. So there are many, many tools that we have. We have Congress, we have courts, which haven't, as I said, have not fully ruled on all of the changes. We have the power of public opinion. We have the ability to protest, and protest is a form of demonstrating public opinion. Protest by itself is not a solution, but it's a it's a way of galvanizing people and of making an argument about who are the real Americans. They use the expression real Americans,
Right.
and what do people want. And so while I would say they've moved very fast, they've broken a lot of things very quickly, they haven't won by any means, and there's plenty of space left for pushback.
Thank you. And I just like one little follow-up on that is like of all the things that like the Trump administration has been doing to disrupt our, our democracy, what would you say is like really your major areas of concern?
So, I have a bias in that I'm deeply bothered by the break with allies and the discomfort that I hear from, the old friends of America around the world. Maybe it's hard for Americans to understand but the reason we have global power and influence and prosperity and the ability to dictate so many rules of trade that have been to our advantage for a long time is because we had this alliance, which was not like Autocracy Inc. It was not an alliance of interests. It was an alliance based on values. And, it went up and down, and there were good times and bad times. But our European allies, and especially, and our Asian allies especially, were a really, really important part of how America was seen in the world and why we were prosperous for so long. And I worry that the shock experience because of the tariffs, because of some of the language used, because of strange incidents like immigration actions against a South Korean factory, that nobody thought they were doing anything illegal. I mean, those things are all, I don't know how easily reparable that will be in the long term. So that bothers me a lot. I would say the use of this quasi-military force against Americans, against immigrants, many of whom are legal or who thought they were legal or who had some kind of legal status here. And very few have turned out to be criminals, and very vanishingly few, and actually most of them are not necessarily illegal either. But even if they were, you don't kidnap people off the street and disappear them into a prison in a different country or in a different state. And I feel that violates many, many deep traditions of, our FBI was always taught, to abide by the Constitution. Our policemen have always worn name tags. We don't have masked men in our streets arresting us, and all that seems to be, to me, also very, pretty profound violation of a lot of American traditions.
Yeah, thank you.
And so, considering Trump's use of executive power and the illegalities, does he have any choice but to disrupt free and fair elections in 2026 and maintain power and stay in office in 2028 any way he can? Because, obviously, if the opposition party, the Democrats, get back into control, he's going to have hell to pay.
So this is an interesting question. I mean, I'm working on a project on that now. I have a colleague at The Atlantic who's writing about this. I mean, obviously, they are going to do what they can to skew the playing field, make an unlevel playing field for the midterms. And some of it's already obvious. I mean, the pressure on state governors to redistrict. We've already worked in Texas, and they're trying in Indiana and some other places. The federal government has demanded voting records from the states. I don't know if you've seen, those of you who would be interested should look up this story. This hasn't had a lot of attention yet. They've been demanding that states hand over their lists of voters. There at the state level. I mean, you probably know it better than I do, actually, from your perspective in North Carolina. But at the state level, there have been a number of laws passed in some states designed to keep some kinds of people from voting. I mean, that's nothing new. The question is, what more will they do? And this I obviously can't predict. I mean, you heard probably Governor Pritzker say out loud that he's afraid that somehow this militarized police force that ICE has become will be used in the what he means, I don't know, to intimidate voters or to give the impression that there's a state of emergency that could make voting difficult in some places, with perhaps places with a lot of Democratic voters a year from now. I don't want to fear monger or pretend there's something, dire happening that isn't going to happen. And as I said, we have a lot of time, and we have a lot of time to for lots of our existing lawmakers to make their opinions clear. But will they try to shape the electoral outcome? Yes, of course they will. Will they do it in ways that are untraditional and that break with past ideas about electoral fairness? Yes, I suspect they'll do that too. And it's incumbent on the rest of us to start following all that very closely, to back them. There are a lot of groups who are doing lawsuits who are following this very closely, and to back them if they can, and again, to be vocal to our representatives and our, in our communities if we see something happening that we find unfair. I mean, that's the best answer I can give right now. Maybe there'll be a different answer 6 months from now. But of course, you're right that it from the beginning seems strange that the president is accruing all this power to himself, arguing that the executive deserves this far more power than any president has ever had. And then you have to ask, and so 3 years from now, are they just going to turn that over to President, I don't know, Gavin Newsom or Ocasio-Cortez or whoever it's going to be? It's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Do you think he's looking for some excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act? I mean, a Reichstag moment like Hitler had when he got full power?
Again, I'm not going to fear monger,
Okay.
and say he's going to do that. I mean, it's, people are, he himself has used that language, and so you have to take it seriously as a possibility. Whether he can do it, whether Congress will let him do it, whether the courts will let him do it, whether they're able to stop him, is still all to play out.
Okay. Pat?
Yeah, the other thing, and just shifting gears a little bit, like we mentioned, that tomorrow is the No King's Day 2.0, and there has been that political science rule of thumb, the 3.5%, that when we engage the population in a nonviolent protest against a government, and we get that many people to turn out, which for America would be like around 12 million, I guess 11 to 12 million. What do you think about that? Do you believe there's any merit to that?
So I don't know about exact percentages or what's the correct number. Probably the March on Washington, which was maybe the most significant protest in American history, probably wasn't that many. I don't. So a lot depends on the context. Protests have different. Let me just say that protests have different purposes, and I let me also say that in 2015 I lived part of the time in Poland, as you said in the beginning. And in 2015, in Poland, we elected a kind of national populist government, and one of the first things that they did was to assault the Polish judicial system, including the equivalent of the Supreme Court. And there were a lot of big marches, there was also a very important women's march after an abortion ban. So there were a number of really big and important marches. And I have to say, from my observation from then, the importance of marches is not necessarily that they can change policy, but they can change the atmosphere. They can make it clear to the people who are ruling that that what they're doing is not inevitable, that they don't have an obvious majority, that not everybody supports them. They change the way news coverage works. They change the way people perceive the situation. And that all sounds a bit mushy, but it's quite important. If it's clear that, there's also an organization that can get many millions of people on the street, then that's something to reckon with. It just doesn't solve the problem. And there are a lot of examples, especially in recent history, although in more autocratic countries, where big protests haven't worked. Venezuela is another one of them. They also have another function, which is that they give people who feel very lonely or feel very distressed by what's happening, it gives them a way to feel connected to a lot of people. And this is a if you go back even further in history, there's a famous example of this in Poland, when Poland was a communist country in 1979, and it was the Pope John Paul, a Polish Pope was named, and Pope John Paul II made his first visit to Poland. And there were these huge outdoor masses, millions of people on airfields and so on. And that, for a lot of people, remember that as the first time they said, oh, wow, there are a lot of people who think like me. It's not just me by myself or me and my family, because people in that country at that time were scared to say things in public. We're not at that stage yet. But big demonstrations have the effect of creating connections, motivating people. When we get to political campaigns later next year, some of those connections will be helpful again. So it's not you won't fix the problem, but you can do something by showing up. And I think, obviously not everybody can show up, but people who can should do it. And also sometimes they're fun. I mean, in Poland, they were fun, and people waved Polish flags and sang the national anthem, and you felt better. I don't know.
And I'd like to just, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that's also important. So.
Oh, okay. I wanted to turn to one of the questions from the audience. And the question is, are there examples of successful fights against autocracy within a country, and what was critical to those successes? And it kind of fits into what you're talking about Poland. Is there more that you can tell us about Poland and moving back from a liberal democracies? I know they've had some setbacks in terms of the election of the president.
Yeah.
And are there other examples, other countries as well that you can point to?
There are a lot of examples. I mean, I actually taught a course last spring at Johns Hopkins, which was called Resistance to Autocracy or something like that, which wasn't meant to be a course about the United States at all. But a lot of the kids in the class immediately began looking for parallels. I mean, Poland is actually a good example. The 2023 election, in which we voted out a government that had tried to skew the playing field, change the rules, make it hard for the opposition to win. There was as here, there was a lot of pressure on news media and attempts to take over newspapers through oligarchic deals, which is another thing that's happening here that is very, very familiar from other places. And I would say there were three things that were important about the Polish campaign. One of them was that there was a very broad coalition that was built. And this is a little easier in a country that you have parliamentary democracy, so there are different parties. But it went from actually the pretty far left to the center right, the right of the center right. There was a group of political parties that agreed to work together, and they had a lot of things that they disagreed about, which became later a problem when they were in government. But for the purpose of the election, they cooperated. And it was that broad coalition, organized around, big themes that united people, that made a really big difference. I mean, the second thing is maybe more technical, although even I think for people in this group, it's useful. The winning parties communicated with people using the tools that people were using. In other words, if young people are on TikTok, they use TikTok. If middle-aged people are watching, YouTube and podcasts, they use that. So the point is that you have to begin to use whatever it is that people are watching, however it is that people are getting their political information, that's where you have to be. And this is something that actually in our country, it's taken a long time for the opponents of the far right to learn that there are that the use of, you have to use social media the way people use it and not wish that everybody read the New York Times or the Atlantic for that matter. And so that's so it's finding the right tools of communication. And it's not that the communication is the message, but the communication does affect the way people hear things. And so learning how to do that is important. And of course, the other thing that's true about new communication, like it or don't like it, and we don't, I would have changed the way social media works a long time ago, but I'm not in charge. But one of the things about it is that anybody can do it. And so that means anyone listening on this call can have an account on any form of social media and can begin to experiment with what's the best way to broadcast what they think, or to start conversations with friends, or conversations with enemies, or whatever. I mean, so there are a lot of opportunities for people who want to be engaged somehow to just be engaged. I mean, you can do it without, you don't need a script, and you don't need someone to tell you how to do it, and you don't need to be in an organization, and you don't even need really any money. You can do it. So that's the second thing, is there was a broad use of technology. And then I would also say that I mean, maybe this is more, it was the choice of issues was very important. That it wasn't that they ignored the populist message. It's just that they also had their own different messages. Here's our alternative. What they weren't just saying, we're against X. They were also saying we're for Y. Here's what we want to see. Here's the vision that we have. Here's the future that we want. And the more that I know we're not quite at that phase yet in the current political cycle, but the more that we can begin to think like that and talk like that, I think that's also very, very important. So that it's not just it's a very negative world out there, and actually all that negative language is very off-putting to people. I know a lot of people, including close friends of mine, just say, I don't want to look at the news anymore. I don't want to watch anything. Everything's ugly. Everything's awful. And I'd rather, I don't know, play tennis or pick flowers. And I have some sympathy for that, but of course that is exactly what autocratic propaganda is designed to create, that kind of apathy, nihilism, cynicism. That's their achievement. That's what they want. And so finding ways to push back against that is also very important. I mean, actually, I heard one of the leaders of Indivisible, on television. I just saw a clip of him today where he said almost exactly this. He said, don't think about it as fighting Trump. Think about it as fighting apathy and cynicism. And I think that's right. It's more about being able to look forward and to be creative and so on. That's part of the that's part of the game too.
Yeah. Before we go, I'd like to sort of spend some more time on what we as activists can do, but we'll sort of save that to the end. But I have heard a lot of observers sort of talk about, the last election, people felt that we were trying to sell democracy versus Trump, as opposed to the specific ideas that the Democrats had, and perhaps that's a key to the future. And it sounds like that's one of the elements that you're trying to bring out here.
It's true. I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule about it. I mean, there are also places where democracy becomes the right. It may be that the word democracy is the wrong word. I mean, maybe what we're trying to remind people of is freedom and rights. Maybe the democracy is too abstract as a term.
Yeah.
But freedom, I think, is something all Americans feel strongly about, and our rights, not to be bullied by the police, our rights not to have our tax money misspent or misused in ways that our Congress didn't decide. Those things I think you can get people to feel strongly about. So a lot is about how you talk about the problems.
How you package it.
Yeah.
Pat, did you have another question?
Yeah, this is also a little bit different, but would love to get your opinion. Given that there's been kind of some renewed support of the Ukraine by Trump and the administration, how do you feel now about maybe Ukraine's ability to win the war with Russia? And if there is a victory for Ukraine, could you talk about some of the global consequences?
So I actually have always thought Ukraine could win the war. And I was in Ukraine about a month ago, and was in one of their spectacular new drone factories, which is one of the ones at the cutting edge of their one of the ways in which they think they could win. Remember where we are. 3 years ago, Ukraine was supposed to be conquered and Kiev was going to fall in 3 days and the rest of the country was going to fall in a few weeks. And there's been doom mongering all along, something terrible is about to happen. The front line's going to collapse and so on. And yet, they keep reinventing the way they fight, and they keep reinventing modern warfare. In fact, it's really hard to, you can't really overstate how creative they've been in their use of what technology they had, in their use of drone technology, and so on. Their latest, what they've been doing over the last few months, is very successfully using long-range drones, and I saw some of them being built. And these aren't little toy drones; these are like little airplanes. They're big, and they can travel for 7 hours, and they can carry warheads. And they've been using them to hit Russian refineries, and they have knocked out, I believe they think, about 20%, maybe more, of Russia's refining capacity, and they, and they're still going. So, and their strategy to win the war has always been about persuading the Russians that it's not worth it. In other words, this war is over when the Russians don't want to fight it anymore. And that's how all colonial wars end, I should say. I mean, that's how, when you think of France and Algeria, or Portugal and its African colonies, there's a point when the imperial capital doesn't want to keep fighting to control the colony because it's just not worth it in money and lives. And the Ukrainians have just been pushing and pushing to get Russia to that point. The difficulty now is that since Trump was elected, I fear that he's drawn out the war by giving the Russians some hope that maybe he would do business deals with them, that maybe he would cut the Ukrainians off, that maybe, he would switch sides, maybe he would break away from Europe. All of those things have convinced the Russian elite that they still think they can win. I mean, they're still talking as if they'll win the war and they'll conquer all of Ukraine and they'll, dismantle the state as it exists now. And there's still, it's still a little murky to me what happened today. Maybe we'll know, in some hours or in the next day or two. But I'm not, I'm worried that Trump hasn't given a definitive enough answer to Putin that will continue to push him in the direction of saying we can't, we don't want to fight anymore. So what's happened in the last 9 months is essentially dragged it out. We haven't really moved. Not only have we not got anywhere towards a ceasefire, we have made it less likely. And I should say the Ukrainians have accepted the possibility of a ceasefire a long time ago to freeze the conflict along the current lines. The Russians have never accepted it. They've never said they would do it. And a lot of the coverage of this was really bad. I mean, there was one point, a few months ago when there was lots of excitable talk about last spring, I guess, about a ceasefire and the end of the war. And I just kept saying, well, the Russians have never said they'll have a ceasefire. Putin has never recognized the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state. And yet people really wanted the war to end. And so they kept talking like it was possible. But I have some similar feels about the Middle East, actually. I mean, I don't think that war's over either. Anyway, that's another topic. But what the Ukrainians have done already is pretty miraculous, and I don't think they're given enough credit for it. And I think they're closer than you might think to creating a situation that's unsustainable in Russia.
We're getting a lot of questions from the audience about what can we do as activists. So it's probably good, since we've got about 10 minutes or so left, to turn to that. In the book, in Autocracy Inc., you mentioned Gene Sharp and his playbook for nonviolent revolution. And those strategies have been widely used. And they not only include, as you know, nonviolent protest and persuasion, but social, economic, and political non-cooperation, and social, physical, economic, and political intervention. Are there things that we can do along those lines that really we haven't been doing at this point? Can they be effective for battling 21st century autocracy?
So some of the Gene Sharp tactics are really for dictatorships, right? I mean, they're some of those tactics are beyond what would work or be necessary in the United States. But what appeals to me about that, this is, for those of you who don't know, it's a famous list. I can't remember now. It's 119
198
tactics.
items, yeah.
That's 198. That's right. It's 100. It's just of things that you can do and ways that you can protest. And what's appealing to me about it is the creativity. Can you, can you use the power of workers in the federal government? Can you use the power of, the post office? Can you use, any institution in the society that has influence can become part of a protest movement. And I guess maybe in the case of the U.S. it's not appropriate to talk about a general strike or something like that, or different kinds of strikes. He talks a lot about that. We're not at that stage yet, but we could, it's not impossible to begin thinking about, what are the targets that we could, identify as weaknesses. I mean, one of the things that worked early on was the protests outside Tesla offices. I mean, it sounds peculiar, but actually the protests outside Tesla offices drew attention to Musk and to what he was doing. They were a cost to him personally. He had trouble selling his cars. It led to him withdrawing from the government, and created a moment of conflict and weakness. And although it didn't end the problems altogether, I mean, it was interesting in that it was, this was a targeted protest at something that would be felt in a particular way. I mean, I don't have I'm now just speaking off the top of my head, but, focusing on the president's crypto businesses, is there a way those could be protested? The ways in which there's so many conflicts of interest and so many ugly ways in which people are making money in this administration. Is there a way to draw an attention to that? I mean, it's the creativity. It's look at what's underlying the system and focus on protesting those things. I mean, that's the essential message.
Yeah, one of the examples you gave in the book, which kind of struck me, was Alexei Navalny in Russia. He did these YouTube videos on the connection of Russia's leaders to financial scams and how he was connected with Putin was connected with all these enablers. So I think that's that kind of struck me because I thought that was sort of an interesting.
No, so the Navalny movement, actually, I should have said it before. I mean, is a very, very important example, because what they did was they talked about corruption, and Navalny himself made these elaborate, almost mini documentaries about corruption, and they were funny and they were well done, and they showed Putin's palaces and so on. But he also connected that corruption to the experience of ordinary people. In other words, your hospitals are bad, your roads are bad, your education system is bad because they've stolen your money. It wasn't just saying they're corrupt, which for a lot of people, these corruption stories are very distant. I mean, I'm very interested in them. I actually publish a kleptocracy tracker on Substack every week. I'm trying to keep track of the many, many conflicts of interest that have emerged. But I know that for a lot of people, it seems very distant. It's just rich people being rich people, and we don't know the difference. But connecting that for people, drawing the dots, what they're doing is harming you. Here's what, the tax cuts for them mean higher healthcare premiums for you, and continuing to make those links. That's a really good way to bring home to people the scale of what it is that they're losing.
Okay. Also in the book, you talk about how competition with autocratic, we shouldn't think of this as a competition with autocratic states, but rather a war against types of autocratic behaviors wherever we find them. And is that, I guess I'm trying to sort of figure out how we make that a realistic, how we take a realistic approach to that.
So, I mean, first of all, identify the autocratic reason. We all know what they are. They're people being afraid to speak in public. They're, the business people who are making concessions before they need to. The lawyers the law firms who have agreed to pay off the president. All those things are autocratic behaviors, and identifying them as such is useful in helping to explain to people what's happening. And helping people understand. I mean, what are the cures? I mean, if you feel afraid to speak or act in public, and many people do, create a coalition, bring some connections, don't speak alone, speak as a group, create a group around yourself, learn to build coalitions between different groups and different people, because it's much easier to fight that kind of thing as a group than it is by yourself. So those are, identifying what they are and finding a way to act anyway. I think that's a helpful way to think about it.
Any advice on how we can stay focused, hopeful, and optimistic?
I mean, go to the march, have a good time. Remember that politics is also just your friends. Get your friends together and, I don't know, have a political discussion, or raise some money, or help a local candidate, or go canvassing. Remember you make it part of ordinary life in a normal way, and don't, not everything has to be an emergency or treated as some kind of disaster or chaos. Just engage with other people as much as you can. I think that's the answer. There's a really fantastic essay that I've been giving to people recently which is actually, I quoted at the end of a previous book, my Twilight of Democracy book. But there's an Italian writer called Ignazio Salone who, he'd been a communist, and then he was disillusioned with communism, and then he may have had some links to the fascists during the war, and he was disillusioned with them. And then, of course, Italy lost the war, and it was a disaster. Everybody was disillusioned with everything. There was no ideology was working, and there was a period of very, it was just money making, and the mafia came back in Italy after the war. And he wrote this essay, well, what should we do? And his conclusion was, the essay is called The Choice of Comrades. And his conclusion was, we should find the people who we agree with, whose morals we admire, and whose values we share, and we should stick with them. And then we should do things together with them. And we should not worry about ideology or, which political program is right. You just identify the people who you feel are right, and then do projects with them. And I think there's something to that seems very, seems right for this moment in a lot of countries, actually, not just in the United States, for me.
Pat has one last question for you.
Yeah, and then I have to get off the phone
Okay,
with this very nice driver who's been here for a long time. So.
It's easy. Do you have another book in the works now?
It's funny you should say. I spent an hour and a half on the phone today talking to a colleague about which of one or two projects I should do next. So I will, but I haven't decided yet. This year I've been trying to, I wrote a lot. I went to Sudan. I tried to understand what was going to be the impact of this presidency on the world and on Europe. And I just felt I didn't want to do another book just yet, but maybe I will.
And thank you so much for your time and your insightful comments and observations this evening. Your work demonstrates the urgent need for global solidarity and defense of democracy. Please check out Anne's book and other
Or this
work.
one. Oh, you can't really see it.
Or that one.
Twilight of Democracy. I don't know, the video is not that good,
Yeah.
or my lighting, but it does say Autocracy Inc. Please check it out, and her other works at your local bookstore. A recording of tonight's program will be available on your YouTube channel. We'll be emailing attendees a link. To everyone who joined us tonight, thank you for being part of Indivisible Charlotte's ongoing efforts to educate, organize, and engage for justice and liberal democracy. Thanks a lot. Thanks again, Anne.
Thank you. Sorry for the technical challenges. It was blame the march tomorrow for creating traffic issues in DC. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
About it. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you for listening to a podcast from Indivisible CLT, based in Charlotte, North Carolina. We believe that democracy is not a spectator sport. Our power is rooted in action, creating opportunities for folks to get involved in their community while strategically building political infrastructure. We organize and engage community by having valuable conversations with voters through deep canvassing, hosting town halls and issue-based educational panels, protesting breaches of our democracy, and holding our representatives accountable. Please share this podcast with others you know. Learn more and join our work by visiting indivisibleclt.org. Help us defend democracy through local action.